I'm just going to start by talking about some basic principles around pay transparency, what we're seeing in the US and then globally, and then I'll turn it over to my other panelists to talk about what you actually do with that. But from a legal perspective, when we talk about pay transparency, first just thinking about it from the US perspective, there's some sort of core things that we see when states, and this really is happening largely at the state level, when states pursue pay transparency. And the first thing, and probably one of the most immediate things in terms of actions that I'm seeing employers having to take, deals with salary range disclosure. So we've got a lot of states now that say, if you post a job or when you post a job, you have to state what the minimum and maximum pay range for that job is. And obviously the idea is that it avoids that situation where it's sort of a different range depending on who applies for the job. The second thing, it's become sort of a universal thing, and there is actually some support for this at the federal level, deals with the impact of prior salary on current compensation. And so a lot of states have said you cannot ask about a candidate's prior salary or use it in any way to determine current compensation. There's some language from courts and the EEOC that sort of support that approach, but there's also specific state laws dealing with it. The third thing, which is sort of, I would say, on the leading edge of this trend, has to do with pay data reporting. It's something that was sort of played around with and didn't really gain much traction at the federal level, but states are now pursuing it, which is affirmatively requiring employers to file certain information about pay and demographics on an annual or every other year basis. So, for example, where I currently am sitting in Chicago, the state of Illinois has such a law requiring employers above 100 employees to certify with the state that pay is not biased based on gender or race, ethnicity, and then you actually have to file hard data about all elements of compensation paid to employees who are sort of considered Illinois employees. The next sort of key element is this idea of internal pay transparency, which is to what extent are employees entitled to see information about pay when, for example, they're going through a promotion or seeking a transfer. And that's something we're seeing the different states sort of play around with, which is to say, not only when you post jobs externally do you have to state the range, but when people are going through these internal processes, you may also have to provide pay information. Again, that's sort of the minority of the states, but it's certainly a trend that should be noted and seems to be a direction that many states probably will end up in. Of course, with all of this and with any legislation, there are significant enforcement penalties depending on what state you're in. We're not seeing sort of the massive assessment of enforcement penalties at this point. It's still very early days, but the framework is certainly there in the laws that are being passed, and certainly something to keep an eye on. One of the things that, and I'm sure for many of you, has gotten a lot of attention is the EU Pay Transparency Directive, which the member states need to adopt by June of 2026. As with all directives in the EU, when you get a directive from the EU, you don't exactly know what it means until the member states decide how they're going to adopt it. So I'm going to talk about what the general parameters of this directive is, and with the big caveat that as of yet, no member state has actually adopted legislation pursuant to the directive. So we don't fully know the details about how it's going to look, but we can make some educated guesses, and I'll talk about what we expect it's going to look like and what that may require of employers. So similar to many U.S. states, there is a salary range disclosure requirement for job postings. There's a salary history ban. There is some very specific pay data reporting around reporting gaps with some remediation requirements when gaps exceed certain levels for larger companies. There is an internal pay transparency requirement. Two elements, though, that are unique, and I want to distinguish from the U.S., are how they approach or how they view pay equity. And so in the U.S., we think about pay for work for the same. Equal pay means you get paid the same for doing the same job or a job that's substantially similar. That's sort of the range of approaches across the U.S. in the EU, they've adopted this work of equal value approach, which means you can have jobs that are substantively different, but they're assessed of equal value. So I'll talk a little bit about that. There are, of course, some pretty significant penalties if employers aren't compliant. I'm not going to get into the scare tactics there, but just know they're there. So let me talk about this work of equal value concept, which is significant. It is significant because it is different than how we in the US tend to think about things, which is I'm going to look at all the jobs that are similar, make sure I'm paying the same. What the EU expects is that you are going to assess the value of a job based on, and they've set 4 criteria. They talk about skills, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. They also allow that other factors relevant to the job or position may impact pay, but these 4 specific things, skills, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, are deemed to be gender neutral criteria that you should be able to draw a line from them to what you're paying for different jobs. This is where the lack of adoption by the member states creates a big question mark, which is, well, how do you do that? And I'll speak briefly to that, and then I know the other panelists will as well. One thing I want to call out in this, because it's an underlying concept behind this approach, there is a concern in the EU that certain jobs are undervalued relative to other jobs. And specifically, the concern is that jobs that have so-called hard or technical skills, there's a perception that they may be overvalued relative to jobs that have traditionally sort of considered soft skills like people management, dispute resolution, collaboration, those sort of interpersonal things. They may not have hard software coding skills, but they are certainly important. And the EU is specifically calling out this issue, saying, hey, employer, you need to make sure you're not undervaluing a class of jobs that have these soft skills. And the concern there, and I'm going to speak briefly about Canada, is that there, for example, in the healthcare setting, there might be medical technician roles that are very technical and valued very highly. But if you look at certain nursing roles, which have an equal level of skill, effort, responsibility required, but they're paid less, there's this idea that maybe the market has some bias in it, where some jobs are perceived as male, some jobs are perceived as female, and that has impacted pay and the valuation of the job over time. So I want to call that out because that is what's sort of behind this idea of equal work of equal value. So that creates an interesting issue, particularly for us in the US. By the way, I think you can see right outside of my window, I've got window washers. So it adds an extra element of danger to this presentation. So in the US and really globally, from a pay perspective, typically what an employer does is get market information about what a competitive pay range is for a job, and then you proceed from there to set the pay for the specific person within that job. And obviously that's sort of a necessary thing. You need to pay at a market competitive level or you're not going to get the talent you need. But again, there is this underlying concern in the EU that there may be segregation in the labor market. And I've got a quote up here about that, this idea that the market may have attitudes and stereotypes that get baked into the data. And so it creates a really interesting challenge, which is how do you set pay that is both market competitive and fair from an EU perspective? And when you think about this, and we're thinking about where do we go from here, I'm going to take sort of my best guess at what's going to happen in the future in the US. We're not going to change in the US. I would be very surprised if we ever took anything other than a market-based approach in the US. We place a heavy value on contract law and the idea that people should be free in the market to negotiate. And so it's highly unlikely from a US perspective, we're going to adopt the EU perspective. And that creates a challenge for anyone with a global workforce, because you can't have one pay structure in the US and a different one in Canada and a different one in Europe. I mean, you can, but it's very difficult to manage. It becomes even more difficult when you have executives, employees working across borders, reporting across borders, moving back and forth. And so that's sort of this challenge that we need to start thinking about, which is how can you validate that not only is your pay structure market competitive, you can do that now, with your market-based studies, but how can you also validate that market-based pay is fair? And the last thing I'm going to say, and it's just sort of an interesting note that I want people thinking about, because it does offer some possible example of how this is already being tackled. So in Canada, for those of you that deal with Canada, for example, Ontario or Quebec, pay equity actually looks a lot like what they're contemplating in the EU. In fact, they oftentimes pay equity plans in Canada adopt those same four criteria: skills, responsibility, experience, working conditions, as sort of the core element of the plan. And what you do in Canada is you do this sort of point factor analysis based on those criteria, and you assign points on usually 1,000-point scale to decide, what is the point total for this job, and then that should correspond with the pay range. And that gives you the ability to then compare jobs that are very different substantively in terms of what they do, but in terms of value are very similar. It's an interesting exercise. I'm not saying that exercise is what will happen in the EU, but it is a precedent that we have and we can learn some lessons from. And I would call that out as just something to think about moving forward. This is an example of what that oftentimes looks like in a pay equity plan in Canada. So with that said, that's sort of the global framework. We've got the US very market-based approach where we're looking for more transparency. The EU approach, which is sort of appears to be moving more in that Canadian direction. And the challenge for you all from a legal perspective, which is making sure that you have a manageable global compensation structure that's market competitive, but you can also validate that it's fair. And I'll turn it over from there to Kelly.
Thanks so much, Andy, and hello all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, now that we have this body of legislation, where do we go from here? So obviously we've had a lot coming at us over the last few years, and really we go back to some of the early legislation in the Scandinavian countries, and then as Andy spoke to in Canada over the last decade or so. That gives us precedent for some of what we're seeing in the US and in the EU in the last several years. And a lot of the focus, particularly in the last couple of years, as we've seen the legislation in the US, our response has been around compliance and risk mitigation. How do we manage investor relations? How do we look at this from that whole compliance lens? But we're seeing more and more focus on really the other side of pay transparency, looking at this and really elevating it to what I would think of as talent competitiveness. How do we embrace pay transparency from an employee value proposition perspective and engagement, and looking at this more from a social movement initiative perspective. I often tell the story of having a conversation with my son after presenting to a client on pay transparency, and he was intellectually curious and asked me about the conversation, and I was explaining to him the concept of the gender pay gap, and he was just taken aback that this actually existed in the United States. And it made me take a step back to think that he's the generation coming into the workforce, and to him it was absolutely unacceptable. So from a talent attraction perspective, his generation won't accept that we have this type of environment for our workforce, and how different that'll be for an organization that can openly disclose that they don't have a gap for any protected class, and how different that will be from the way in which they engage their talent. So it's so much beyond being the right thing to do. So when we think about it from that perspective, and we think of there's lots of positive things, right? Increases fairness and equality, helps us to identify underlying issues, removes embedded bias, acts as a driver to attracting talent, gives us a level playing field, increases trust and loyalty, and acts as a motivator. But we also need to be cautious that there are a lot of things that it could also trigger, that we have unintended consequences. It could lead to wage inflation. I've been in a presentation where I had someone raise their hand and say, well, could I just increase everybody's salaries so I don't have a pay gap? Theoretically, I suppose that could be an answer. Sounds like a really costly answer, but there, just as Andy described, there are a lot of other criteria beyond just the pay criteria that you need to address. It could lead to a loss of talent. I mean, if we're trying to explain concepts around why you might be paying someone at one level versus another, when we start to have open transparency, there's a lot of change in communications that goes along with that, right? So that could increase employee relations issues. That could increase equal pay claims because we're now disclosing much more information. It could highlight the lack of weak compensation processes. And Andy just went through how we typically go through developing salary ranges. You need to be very buttoned up in the way in which you collect data, establish your peer group, how you're pulling that data through. There's a lot of work that goes into building a good and sound compensation approach. So if that's not something that you have done regularly, it may highlight that there are weaknesses in those processes. And they could disengage and challenge managers who have not been accustomed to having to share this type of information. So there's a lot of work to be done. So lots of good intention, but a lot of work to get there. So when we think about it from that perspective, we think of kind of four elements that we would consider to be core. I'm going to talk about kind of the bookends, job architecture and change communications. And then Anuj is going to talk about the two in the middle, pay equity and reporting requirements. So thinking about that first, kind of job architecture, I think of that as building the foundation, because everything else we're talking about is starting at the job architecture level. And I think of job architecture as functions, families, jobs, and levels, really establishing that strong foundation, and of which we're building everything else on top of that. So on that compliance side, this is pay equity, pay transparency, pay parity, all the compliance components that we're talking about. But then on the right-hand side, compensation design, all the things we're talking about from the comp perspective. And when we're talking about EU pay transparency, we're talking about total rewards, right? Because we're talking about compensation, benefits, retirement, all the total rewards components. Job evaluation. Job evaluation is mentioned 9 times in the EU directive. So gender neutral job evaluation, the criteria that Andy was speaking about. Pay mix optimization. So we're looking at disclosing on compensation, making sure that we have very non-discretionary elements around our pay mix. Workforce planning, how we're looking at representation in the workforce. Change in communications, how we're helping our managers to start to disseminate this information and feel comfortable in the way in which they're looking at pay transparency. So when we think about, if we kind of flip job architecture and think about it, not just from that compliance perspective, so internal pay fairness, as well as looking at it from the external competitiveness perspective. And I'm hedging my bet with Andy. I don't think we're going to see the types of changes that we're talking about in the EU, and we already see established in Canada. In the US, I always call it my crystal ball theories. But also on the right-hand side, career progression, because job architecture is going to inform skills and the way in which that we look at our talent components, not just our compensation components, and the way in which we look at mobility. So the other side of this is how critical, and I talk about this all the time, in any space in which we're looking at rewards or talent design elements, is as an HR consultant who's been in this space for a long time, I like to think that you get pretty good at this over time. But where the rubber really meets the road is in the change and communication space, and how critical at this point it is that we really get this right, because we are really asking our leaders and our managers to learn and disseminate information that they may not be comfortable with themselves. So really important that we get leaders on board to champion the change, to embrace pay equity and transparency as core to the organization. We're really focused on training managers, and this isn't just FAQs, this is true training, and educating employees so they feel that they understand how their pay is determined. They understand the elements of pay transparency. they understand legitimate differences. You know, we're not all paid the same. There's a reason why we're not all paid the same. And there's legitimate reasons why we shouldn't be. So I kind of think of this in kind of 6 key elements. Taking ownership of the message, making sure that it's pervasive throughout the organization, getting leaders on board. I mean, this is critical in any, kind of big C change, but even more so now when we're talking about this kind of pervasive change. Aligning external and internal messaging, thinking about that employee value proposition perspective, how powerful and how critical it is to make sure that that's the messaging that is both external in the way in which you're talking about the organization and recruiting new talent, that it's the same that's reflected within the organization. Aiming for manager excellence. Again, this is not FAQs. This is really pervasive in the way in which you're onboarding managers, bringing managers along throughout the process, how you're building your salary structures and your compensation plans. Within the directive, there's clauses around how you are developing your compensation plans that are going to need to be disseminated within a transparent way. So there's more and more that's going to be asked of our managers. Putting pay transparency into the big picture. So this is really thinking of it as part of your overall employee value proposition, not just this is something we need to do in order to be compliant. And then engaging your employees, making sure they're part of the process, that they're brought along just in the same way that your managers are brought along. And then this is the one thing I think has been more impactful than many of the things that I've shared with clients kind of in the last few years as we've kind of been on this pay transparency journey. And this is even more applicable to the EU directive than in the US. So thinking about what needs to be done for reporting in 27 and thinking through all the things that you need to be looking at and contemplating in order to be in a position to be reporting for pay transparency compliance. So thinking through what needs to be done when. I think of 24 as the year that you should be kind of getting your ducks in a row. This is the year that you should be thinking about job architecture, making sure that you're doing pay equity analysis. If you're not doing it on a regular basis, this is certainly the year that you should be doing your baseline. Starting to look at all your market data, updating your salary structures, so that you're moving into 25 with job architecture review and job evaluation. You're also starting to look in 25 as to how you're looking at total rewards more holistically. For larger organizations, this may have an impact on your HRIS system. That has a lead time. If you are in works councils countries, that has a significant lead time from an informed perspective. So thinking through backing up from 27 when you're reporting and when the laws come into place in 26, and backing up from a design perspective. If you're going through job evaluation and job architecture design, these could be 12 to 18 month processes. So thinking through timing of when you should be started, this is really when we should be really getting our arms around this so that we have 25 going into 26 to be thinking about those design elements. So that's what I wanted to leave you with. And I am now going to pass over to Anuj. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you, Kelly, and thanks, Andy. Great information, and thank you for walking us through that. Appreciate it. Before we get in, there's a poll question that we would love for the audience to answer. We'll give it a couple of seconds here, but essentially, do you currently have a pay transparency strategy? We've conducted this poll in the past, and there's been very different results, and would love to see what results we get here. So I'll give it a couple of seconds here before we proceed. All right. Well, let's look at the results. So 50% of the attendees here have indicated that you do have a strategy in place. About 41% is working on it, and about 8% have not started. Um, Interesting. We've seen a little bit of different results in the past few weeks that we've done this. Even a few months back, we saw different results, and happy to kind of walk the audience through that in a separate meeting. But anyway, moving on to what Kelly had indicated. It was a really great roadmap. Part of that roadmap was looking at pay equity and the pay reporting component that is more specific to the EU, but also US has their own kind of version of pay transparency. So we'll get into what that really means from a pay equity standpoint. But when it comes to really employer responsibilities, at least in the EU, what we're really looking at from a reporting standpoint is that there is a pay data reporting component. There's about 7 different metrics that organizations need to report on. But then there is this other component to the pay transparency, or the EU pay transparency regulation, that is around the joint pay assessment. And the joint pay assessment really kind of talks about that if employers are unable to justify and correct pay gaps, and these are kind of pay gaps of 5% or greater, then they're subject to a joint pay assessment as and when the regulation goes live. Now, of course, as member nations adopt it, it would maybe look different. So far we've only had Sweden that has really released some form of kind of early adoption, but we're waiting on other member nations to release. But that's kind of the reporting requirement. Really what organizations right now are doing is they're really getting ready for that joint pay assessment. They're evaluating whether the gaps are above 5%, below 5%. If it's below 5% at all categories, then you're really not looking at a joint pay assessment when this regulation goes live. So that's really what organizations are preparing for today, and moving into kind of 2025 and 2026. That's really where it's going to head towards. Then there's the transparency requirements. So employers are required to provide information on the initial pay level and the salary range to applicants. Obviously, as is the case in US with different states, EU is also talking about that you cannot really ask applicants for their prior pay history, and we've known that really ends up creating a lot of pay equity issues. So that's on the transparency requirement. And then there's the transparency equity standards, and this is where the equal pay for work of equal value or equal work really comes in. A lot of it is can be addressed through a robust kind of job architecture study, and really understand and determine what those work of equal value or equal work kind of groups are. And if the job architecture is done correctly, you can get those groups done, identified, and that would be a basis and fundamental for doing an effective pay equity analysis. So that's really on the employer responsibility standards. And of course, there is penalties for non-compliance. There's to Andy's point, not getting into the whole fear tactics, but there are non-compliance penalties that are there. Now, before you report, one of the main things that organizations should understand is that, how does your pay gap decompose? And essentially what that means is, what is explaining your pay gap within the organization. So pay equity audit, of course, will identify the drivers of pay. And because you are at underlying of a pay equity audit, you are running a multiple linear regression, and that will give you the drivers of pay. And that is one thing that organizations absolutely should understand, that what component of that factor that's going in explains the pay gap. So getting into that kind of pay gap decomposition becomes very important. And that will help you kind of just understand what that unexplained kind of pay gap is. With respect to data collection and reporting, so we look at it from the lens of CART, which really does cover all of the EU member nations, and just not EU member nations, but globally, whether you're looking at APAC, you're looking at US, it kind of can cover every single jurisdiction that has some kind of a pay equity law or some kind of a pay data reporting law, and it really fits into this CART framework. So what is that framework? Well, it really means collection, analysis, reporting, and transparency. So the kind of data that's needed would obviously differ by jurisdiction, and organizations need to start getting ready and start collecting that data. And that data could be pay data, representation data, demographic data, all sorts of different kinds of data. Could be living in your HRIS system, in your payroll systems. Typically, we're seeing that with the pay data reporting component, it's usually the payroll data that is required by the regulatory agencies. So you start collecting that data that's needed. So first step is identify what that data is and start collecting that data. Then certain jurisdictions are going to have the analysis component. So make sure that you complete that analysis, whether it's as simple as just determining what the median pay gaps are or the average pay gaps, or actually doing a full-blown pay equity analysis, as in the case of an EU pay transparency directive. Conduct that analysis. Now, this is where the confusion lies. In certain jurisdictions, you're reporting the payroll data, but you're conducting the analysis on compensation data. So understanding how can you translate the two, if you do an analysis on the compensation data and you start to remediate, how does that flow back into the payroll data? That's an important component to understand. Then the next one is really reporting. So that could be either you're reporting internally, you're publishing something on the website, or you're reporting it externally to a larger audience, whatever it is required by that jurisdiction, you're performing that reporting. And then finally, it's the transparency component, which is either you're publishing the pay ranges externally, you're publishing it internally, you're publishing any kind of progressions that are required under the jurisdiction. Essentially, you're just being transparent about what those ranges are. So this framework really fits in. Certain jurisdictions might have all of these that are necessary. So collection, analyses, reporting, transparency. Certain jurisdictions, you might just have to collect the data and sit on it and not really do anything with it. There are certain jurisdictions in Asia where all you have to do is collect that data and sit on it until the regulatory agency asks you for that data. So you could, there's jurisdictions like that too. But essentially the first step is just take all of those jurisdictions, see which ones apply to you, and then start to categorize them into which jurisdictions need, where I just have to collect the data and sit on it, where I have to collect the data and analyze the data and then report on it, where I also have to be transparent with ranges. Start to categorize those different jurisdictions from this CART framework. One other thing I will say is that, interestingly enough, US is pretty big on intersectional analyses. We know that Labour Party coming in UK, there's been some talks about ethnicity reporting being added to the pay gap reporting. But the role of intersectional becomes very critical. We are all, in fact, we just, as human beings, we can't be identified just with one single thing. We're not just female, male, non-binary. We are, male of a certain race, ethnicity category, of a certain age group, of a certain demographic. So there are these different shared characteristics that represent who we are as a human being, and that is reflective in a lot of different regulations and contemplated in a lot of different regulations. So just not from a regulatory standpoint, but really from a proactive, being at the forefront, you're an organization that really wants to lead in this space, you should start to look at it through an intersectional analysis. That's very critical. I can't tell you how many times I've had organizations that have said, you know what, Anuj, you keep talking about compliance, but I want this organization, I want our organization to be at the forefront of this transparency, pay transparency, just the whole movement that's happening. And part of it is I want to look at it through the intersection of different demographics. So it's critical that even though it may not be required under certain jurisdictions, that you should look at it through intersectional approach, that you'd look at it if you want to be at the forefront and lead the charge for what we call as, lead the charge to pay transparency. But an effective pay equity analysis will include the intersectional. Of course, if you're just looking at it from the compliance standpoint, you don't have to. But it really starts with these steps, and having a very robust and fundamental foundation set for a pay equity analysis will actually allow you to build on that and build correctly. Can't tell you how many times you looked at different employers running pay equity analyses. They've either not done reliability and robustness checks, they haven't looked at taintedness, they've only looked at maybe adjusted R-squared values on the multiple linear regression. They haven't looked at all this other reliability and robustness tests. So they're really thinking, oh, my adjusted R-squared looks great, so my model would be great. Well, that's not true. But it really starts with laying these kind of fundamentals and foundation to your pay equity. So setting the foundation, of course, certain a lot of US organizations love to do this under attorney-client privilege. Absolutely, should establish those protocols. Look at your compensation policy, define the scope, look at what factors are you going to use in the regression model. Maybe you might have to consolidate those factors, form those category of employees. If you're doing it through the EU lens, you're looking at work of equal value. If you're doing it through the lens of US, you may be looking at comparable work. So forming those groups of employees, category of employees correctly, maybe statistically testing those groups to ensure distinctiveness, as well as large enough pool to have a very robust regression analyses. Maybe you do that. And then you conduct the analyses and you look at all of the robustness criteria, you make sure that the models are great, and then you start to remediate. And you let that kind of flow. Again, from looking at it from an EU standpoint, you let that flow into the payroll data such that when time comes to report on that payroll data, everything looks great. And then, of course, while you're doing this, you want to make sure that you don't create additional pay equity issues. So making sure that holes in the boat, as we like to say, are plugged, so that you're not creating additional pay equity issues. So one such thing on these pay transparency reporting requirements is talking about contextual narratives. So there are different frameworks that organizations can use to really write a very effective contextual narrative. And those frameworks could differ, but at a high level, it talks about, what is the context of this? So definitely putting into your narrative, what is the context of this reporting requirement? Looking at the data, explaining the data in your contextual narrative, explaining clearly and articulately what methodology was used, the results limited to what they're actually asking you to disclose in that reporting requirement. So really referring to those results in a very articulate and concise fashion and talking about that. Explaining your gaps, whether those gaps are through differences in demographics or differences in pay, really explaining those gaps. And then one key component is really ongoing commitment from for the organization from a policy and strategy perspective, ensuring not just pay equity, but workplace equity within the organization. So really, what is the organization's ongoing commitment? Having that be part of the contextual narrative also becomes very critical. It's actually a very good tool. So certain countries like UK and Ireland require you to have contextual narratives because, as you can imagine, you're really just kind of reporting on this raw pay gap, raw pay data, maybe quartiles, et cetera. So it doesn't really give a complete picture. But with that contextual narrative, as you publish that on your website, now that really helps organizations understand and provide an explanation as to what's happening within the organization. So, having that effective contextual narrative becomes very important. And obviously there are different tools, different platforms that organizations can start to look at. Our tool here is called Workplace Equity Platform. We are working very closely with Norton Rose Fulbright and Aon and in different capacities. But if there's any questions on the tools, just please reach out. Happy to walk you guys through it. But that's really it. We'll open it up for questions. Over to you, Olivia.
We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions to the Q&A on the left-hand side of the slides. Our first question today is, does it make sense to develop a pay transparency strategy if you aren't required to by law, and why?
Okay, so Olivia, I'll take that one. I would say absolutely. So to my first slide. So we think about, so first of all, pay transparency is here to stay. So if you're not required by law, you certainly are going to be required by law at some point in time, because pay transparency continues to grow, evolve, and penetrate more and more countries, regions, states, depending on where you are in the world. So you are going to be required at some point in time. So from the compliance perspective, it is going to touch you eventually. Two, so if we think about the other side of that from the talent perspective, and we think about it from your employee value proposition, it's going to make you a more competitive organization from that perspective. So I think absolutely it's bigger than compliance, and you should be thinking of it from that perspective, to think of it more holistically in how you are looking at how you embrace pay transparency in the broader perspective.
Thank you, Kelly. Our second question today is, who from your organization should you include when developing your pay transparency strategy?
Well, I'll jump in. So obviously you'll need the people that have the ability to master the data. And so usually you need sort of your internal HRIS system guru, and of course your compensation and rewards people. I'll make a pitch for your legal department. Don't start an exercise without talking to them. I can't tell you how many times I've been brought in when that's happened, and there's all sorts of misunderstandings and concern. Personally, if done properly, I have very little worry about clients undertaking these analyses. It's just doing it the right way, and doing it the right way means having all those key stakeholders at the get-go, especially legal. They can set the framework for attorney-client privilege. And the last thing I'll say about that, and this gets back to the last question, which is, should you do it? Sometimes I think people are worried that if they do it, something bad will happen. And I'll tell you, you shouldn't worry about that. If you set the right sort of framework and you do it in a privileged manner, what's really cool about these analyses is it gives you the ability to identify situations, not necessarily big, grand compliance concerns or worries about class action lawsuits, but actual specific employee issues. Individual cases where maybe somebody's pay just isn't even remotely where it should be, and you're given the chance to fix it. You're given the chance to identify possible internal issues, so you don't repeat them, and so you don't lose people. You're not throwing good money after bad on sort of the same problem and over again. So they're really a positive thing to do, but it's just kicking it off the right way.
So just to add to Andy's response there, a little bit of motherhood and apple pie. So going back to the change communication aspects of this, we typically do a stakeholder analysis up front, which, to my point about the kind of the 6 key points, that involves everyone. That's your executive team. That's how you're communicating to managers. That's how HR is involved, how's the total rewards team involved. So each piece of your organization is involved in a different way. So yes, absolutely legal. I'm going to give Andy that that as well. Legal should be involved right up front. But each piece of your organization is involved in a different way. Risk should be involved. Your executive sponsor should be involved. So you should be thinking through holistically everyone that needs to be involved in how you're rolling out your pay transparency initiative.
Thank you, Andy and Kelly. We got a couple more questions here. One of them is long. So could you provide a high-level recommendation on key factors to consider when implementing pay and total reward strategies across Canada, the US, and Europe? In addition to compliance and legislative requirements, what other perspectives should we address to ensure a tailored and effective approach in each region?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll start, and then maybe Kelly, you can jump in. The first thing I would say is look at Kelly's slides, right? You want to have a consistent architecture. I mean, that's the foundation. You want to have a consistent job architecture globally upon which pay is built. That said, there will be variation. Canada is very different in its approach to pay equity. You have to have specific pay equity plans for the provinces, so for Ontario, for Quebec, you have to engage, for example, in Quebec, you have to create a pay equity committee and engage with them consistent with the statute. So it will necessarily look a little different. And of course, in Europe, you're going to have works councils that you have to engage with. So the architecture should be consistent across the board. The way things actually happen in each jurisdiction, there will be some variation. There will be consultation with different stakeholders, workers groups that you will have to work with. But to the extent you have that harmonious global architecture, it's really going to help you in those sort of one-off discussions, region by region, because you'll be able to say, you work in the context of this overall job architecture. This is how we look at it. And that really actually enhances your position when you're negotiating on some of these issues with those worker groups, because your message is not, we're trying to not do something. It's we're trying to do something consistent and fair across the globe. And so that's one thing I'd say. The other thing is, while the analysis may look slightly different in each country, I do think it is helpful to establish global benchmarks that you're regularly looking at, so you don't get some major disconnects within your organization where one job is just paid in a very different way, maybe a lot more in one region than another. That can create internal friction that can become unmanageable.
So I'm going to add to that. So Andy, I appreciate you. Thank you. Yes, global consistency, local applicability. So, and to Andy's last point, a benchmark should be the same globally, unless there are, in some cases, we may be looking at a much bigger region that may have a different level, and that there's reasons for that because it's a bigger job. But for the most part, there should be global consistency. You should be able to have global consistency while having a nod to any local, laws, to culture. I mean, there may be things that are different about that culture. What always comes to mind for me is the way in which you look at salary structures in India, for example, tends to be a bit nuanced. So you'll culturally look at India a little bit differently than you may look at, say, Brazil. So there may be some nuances around the way in which you look at pay progression in certain areas. But you can absolutely have global consistency by looking at that foundational job architecture.
Amazing. Thank you both. And then last question here today, another long one. Please provide a basic example of what impact recruiters offering high salaries to applicants has on pay equity from a statistical standpoint. I tried to draw out a simple regression line showing that if someone is hired above the line, everyone below the line needs a pay increase to return to pay equity. Thank you.
Guess I could take that one. So, I think one of the things that organizations are actually instituting is this concept of a pay equity range that's a function of, so it's statistically calculated and it's a function of your internal data. So if you were to, and the idea is that these pay equity ranges are formed agnostic of someone's protected class, such as gender, race, ethnicity, all of that good stuff. But you have this pay equity range. Now, if you go outside of that pay equity range, yeah, you could potentially, create a pay equity issue. You could improve the pay equity issue. It just depends on, what kind of, what is the demographic of the person that you are hiring from a recruiting standpoint. which again has its own kind of challenges. But then if you start to hire people more towards that right side of that pay equity range, you could start to see that entire range shift more and more on the high side. Now, if you do bring in someone, outside of that range, maybe below that range or above that range, it just depends if you have to bring people up to that line to compensate for the fact that you went outside of that range. It just depends, because like I said, maybe hiring a certain demographic actually improves your pay equity status, as opposed to creating a pay equity issue where you have to compensate for people that are in those existing comparable roles and bring them up. It just kind of depends on what demographic you hire, and that's why it becomes challenging when such kind of tools are available, where you got to make sure that you're not simulating candidates, in different demographic candidates applying for the role. You're not simulating that. Oh, what happens if I hire a female employee? What happens if I hire a male employee at this range or this salary that may be above the pay equity range that you've created for that role? So you probably don't want to do that, because that can have a lot of unethical and illegal consequences. But hopefully that kind of addresses the question. So really it depends is the answer. The long-winded answer is this. I took a long approach to getting to this answer, but it's just, it depends. If you go outside of that range, if you hire a certain demographic, it could improve your pay equity status. Thereby, you don't have to compensate by bringing other people up. But if you hire a certain demographic and it creates a pay equity issue, then you may have to bring other people up to that line to compensate for the fact that you've now created a pay equity issue.
Amazing. Thank you, Anuj. And then, sorry, there was one last question. Besides the EU and the US, do you foresee any similar regulations in Latin America or in Asian countries going forward?
Andy, you want to take Andy, that, or Kelly?
Crystal ball question. We already have legislation in Asia. So I'm going to say yes. Yes, I think we will continue to see more and more pervasive legislation. We already have some legislation in Asia. Andy, you certainly are more the expert than I am. You can speak to it directly.
Yeah. So yes, there is some in Asia. We're not seeing massive movements yet in Latin America on this front, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that develop. I guess the way we tend to look at it is, and this gets back to the prior question, if you have the global sort of infrastructure right, and you're constantly taking your lessons learned from each jurisdiction and bringing them back to other jurisdictions, you should be well prepared for anything that may pop up in Latin America or in Asia. That said, whatever happens in those jurisdictions, I'm not anticipating something that's going to be materially different than the sort of directions we already have, right? So we have the concepts of work for the same job, equal pay for the same job, equal pay for substantially similar jobs, equal pay for work that is of equal value. Those are kind of the three frameworks, and I don't anticipate anything other than something in those frameworks. And so all of the things that we've been talking about will put you sort of in a good position wherever and whatever may pop up in any other jurisdiction.